And hello, friends. We welcome you to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Television. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in West Virginia, Ohio, and Kentucky. I'm Elliot Parker. It's great to have you with us. We're featuring poetry and talking about poetry here on our program today with Ohio University Southern Professor of English and also poet Hayley Mitchell Haugen today. Hayley Mitchell Haugen joins us here on the program. She holds a Ph.D. In 20th Century American Literature from Ohio University and an MFA in Poetry from the University of Washington. She's currently an Associate Professor of English at Ohio University Southern, where she teaches courses in composition, American literature, and creative writing. Her poetry has appeared or is forthcoming in Nerve Cowboy, Poetry Northwest, Rattle, Slant, Spillway, and many other journals. Her critical essays have appeared in publications such as The Body in Medical Culture, on the literary nonfiction of Nancy Meyers, and Stephen King's contemporary classics, Reflections on the Modern Master of Horror and Elsewhere. And she's also the author of the poetry chapbook, What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward to, which we'll talk about here on the program today. So Hayley, it's delighted to have you here. Welcome to Chapters. It's nice to see you today.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to ask you first about poetry and how you got interested in poetry and what it is about poetry that you like or that you sort of gravitate to as a writer.
I began writing poetry in the early 1990s when I was an undergraduate at Cal State Long Beach in California, and I thought I wanted to be a newspaper journalist. Walked into that first classroom, had a lot of typewriters set out, a lot of deadlines built into the class, and I decided that was not for me. Second semester, I took a poetry class from one of my mentors, Charles Webb, and that did it for me. I realized I want to teach creative writing, I want to write poetry, and that's what I set out to do from then. And I just enjoy it. It's a great way of self-expression, and it's always my fallback genre. I've tried different things, but I always come back to poetry.
When you teach creative writing and you teach poetry, what are some of the things that you work with your students on in terms of teaching poetry? And maybe if someone out there watching our program in the audience is thinking about trying poetry, some things they need to think about or consider, or some genre concerns they should have as they get started.
I love teaching the poetry classes because inevitably most of the students have not written poetry before, so it's great to start with that blank slate. And in my class, we write 12 poems in a semester, and the students have no idea where those poems are going to come from. And so we just break down techniques into little boxes to start with. And so I think some advice for people just starting out in poetry is, write what you know. I know it's cliche, but that's where I start with my students. I don't give them topics to write about, but I do give them some craft ideas, some craft things to focus on. So one week we might just focus on using metaphor and simile and talking about imagery and not feeling like you have to understand the whole package of poetry when you're first starting out, because that will all come. And then we move on to sound effects and voice and persona poems and just trying lots of different things. So if you're not in a classroom experience, there's lots of great books out there. Writing Down the Bones is a great book for new writers. Bird by Bird by Anne Lamont, that's a great book. That just will give you ideas, things to write about, but you don't have to be an expert at all the craft. That comes with practice.
Very good, excellent. So I noticed that you've written in some other genres, and you talked about that. And we'll certainly get to your poetry chapbook in just a little bit, because there's so many great poems I want to ask you about in there. Stephen King's contemporary classics, Reflections on the Modern Master of Horror and Elsewhere. How did you get a story into that publication. What was that process like in terms of submitting and feedback and editing and all of that? And I know that before we started taping, you mentioned that you've got another one coming out in a different anthology. So tell us first a little bit about the Stephen King Contemporary Classics, how that process went for you, and then how the process has gone for the new journal that you've got a submission coming out in.
Okay. For the Stephen King piece, this was just one of those happy accidents that happen for academics. I was working towards tenure, and during my tenure I was focusing more on critical essays than poetry, so I really had about a 10-year hiatus from poetry as I completed my Ph.D. and then worked towards tenure. And I happened to be reading a Stephen King book during the summer. I'm a big fan of Stephen King. I was reading him on Kindle. The book was called Duma Key. Didn't know anything about it. It was just a random Kindle selection, and then I found myself annotating it in the margins as on my Kindle as I'm writing. I thought, oh my goodness, I'm working here. I'm writing an essay, and I'm interested in illness and disability, and that particular novel has to do with both of that. And when I came back after summer break, I just happened to see a call for papers for the Pop Culture, American Culture Conference that was being held, and there's two gentlemen who run the Stephen King panels for that, and I submitted an idea for what I had been annotating, and they enjoyed that and went and gave that presentation. And then the next year they said, we're going to be putting this anthology together, and we'd like you to work on your piece that you presented at the conference. And so I'm always telling my students, learn how to write that abstract, because the abstract opens doors to different things. And so we did the conference, and then did the publication. And then since then went on to do more conferences for the Stephen King panels at the Popular Culture Conference, and was again invited to submit a second piece. So that piece is actually in the editing process right now. I'm waiting to hear back. I'm sure there'll be some revisions.
Okay, so tell us, what's the subject matter of that piece, as much as you can give away?
What is that one? I have to try to remember. In that piece, I'm looking at Stephen King's Mr. Mercedes, which has been, I'm not sure if it's already out on TV yet, but it will be a series. But I'm mainly focusing on the first book in the trilogy, and I am looking at the topic of sympathy for mass murderers, and how the public's perception of mass killers changes as it goes through the media process, and as we learn more about it. And this is a piece that is also connected with mental illness, so I always tie in the illness and disability angle as well. So I feel like I'm still working in my field of scholarship and research, but having fun with Stephen King
That's great.
At the same time.
Fantastic. That's excellent. You mentioned that you've done some work at California State University, Long Beach. Mm-hmm. You grew up in Southern California before sort of moving all the way across the country into Appalachia, or what we consider Appalachia. How did growing up in Southern California, how has that influenced your writing, influenced your teaching, your scholarship, and what's that been like, making that transition from that culture to Appalachian culture?
Okay, that's a great question. I think in terms of my writing, I consider myself a West Coast poet. My early mentors were West Coast well-known writers, very well-known, especially in the what we might call the stand-up poetry scene. So when I was an undergrad, I had a lot of opportunity to do a lot of public readings of the cafe scene in Long Beach, and also had a very early introduction into the small press. And I think that really influenced my writing a lot in terms of, I always felt that there was an audience out there for my work, and it didn't necessarily have to be a huge audience, but I've always been a proponent of the small press, and I think that's kept me writing and kept me sending my work out. And it's also been great because I could pass all that knowledge to my students as well. I don't tell them to sit around and wait till they have a prize-winning collection of work. Find where those poems go in the small press. So, so that upbringing I think I was in the right place at the right time in Long Beach when a lot of that scene was just really burgeoning, and that really affected me. And I think in terms of content, as well, that West Coast influence, just openness about the body. You see that a lot in my work, and that sense of not feeling censored at all. that have poems that have a kind of performability to them, meant to be read aloud and work on the page. I'm still striving towards that. As I'm writing more and more now, I seem to be doing more form poetry, which I never thought I would do. So, I feel like I'm in the middle of a sea change right now and try some new things. But the topics tend to be about the same.
Excellent.
Yeah.
I know my first exposure to you came from your chapbook. And I say exposure, I don't mean that derogatorily, but the first time I really got into some of your poetry was your chapbook, What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward to. Before I ask you a couple questions about some of the poems in here that I really liked, the front cover really caught my attention, and we have what looks like a baby basket or a baby bed with the sort of the arched protector over it. But then we've got two ravens or crows maybe that are sort of hovering on the edge there, and then we get an impression that there's others sort of flying around. Tell us a little bit about that cover and how that kind of ties into some of the themes that are present in that chapbook.
Okay. So this cover actually ties into the base poem, the What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward to poem, which is about how girls fare in the world of the Grimm fairy tales. And there's a line in the poem about the brothers being turned into crows, and very fairy tale like. So this image is specifically from that poem with the seven brothers, the seven crows on that. And I am very partial to this image because it was drawn by an ex-student of mine from Cal State Long Beach, David Hernandez, who is a fabulous artist, but has also gone on to be quite a player in the contemporary poetry world, has won major prizes, has numerous books published. So it's a little honor to have his artwork on my piece too. So,
that's great. One of the things that surprised me the most about the Grimm's fairy tales, and I've talked about this with a couple other authors we've had on the program, we as kids sort of get the sanitized version of the fairy tales, but if you read the original Grimm's fairy tales, the original as they were written to be intended in terms of read and published, I'm amazed at how different they are, how violent they are, how adult the themes are that are being dealt with there, and how the people that you hope get their comeuppance in the original Grimm's fairy tales. It's just fascinating to study that and look at the original tales compared to what we see and read and hear about as kids growing up. It's really fascinating.
They're much more grim. Right?
Yes, absolutely. So when you think of the Grimm, you definitely see why the connection is there.
And while the collection isn't focused on fairy tales, there are some other poems that borrow from some of those themes. Of a poem, "The Girl Who Cried Lupus," is going back to those childhood stories as well. So.
And that's the first poem I was going to ask you. It's one of my
great.
favorites in the connection, "The Girl Who Cried Lupus." And what really caught my attention about the poem is first of all, it's kind of all sort of one big stanza, but the terms that we see there: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, SIDS, tumors, cirrhosis, psoriasis. It just goes on and on. Very powerful words that when you read them, as you're reading them as the reader, and you see those words come up, you almost sort of stop and pause because if you don't know all the complexities or how it's going to apply in this poem, what Parkinson's is, what psoriasis is, or you think about somebody who's had that or a TV commercial that talks about that. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that poem. You mentioned it kind of ties into and takes some ideas from the original Grimm's fairy tales, but what's really going on in that poem? It's one of my favorites in the chapbook.
Okay. Am I allowed to read it as well?
Oh, sure,
Do I get to
absolutely.
read it?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Shall I read it first?
Yes. Yeah.
Then
You could read it first, and then because I think it's so good to be read because of, like I said, those words, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and we know those terms, and we know the debilitating effects those terms can have. But I'll let you read it first, and then tell us a little bit about it.
And they're not very poetic terms, so you don't really expect to find them in a poem. But okay. This is "The Girl Who Cried Lupus." The town had its Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and SIDS. Its folks had their cancers, tumors blossoming like weeds in the best-kept flower beds. They had their scleroses, cirrhoses, and psoriasis. So when the girl grew tired on the playfields, when she struggled up the steep hills on her roller skates and came home aching, they had no room between their leukemias, their lymphomas. They didn't want to have to name it. Growing pains, they told her. We all went through it. And when she was in high school and her hair fell out, bit by thinning bit, slowly clogging up her father's stainless steel plumbing fixtures, they worried more about common things, the things they knew about, their ingrown toenails and ear infections, the wart epidemic at the local spa. Some even pointed and snickered. Look, they said, she's sloughing off like the summer dogs. And some years later, when the mottled rash unfurled, staining her cheeks like an unchecked leaking shoe polish, making her look raccoon-like, wolfish, a few thought it was cute. Besides, gum disease was big then, and Down syndrome. They said take vitamins, maybe, get some sun. Time passed and they had their anomalies, their webbed feet and speech impediments. They didn't seem to notice her front paws clicking down the sidewalk, didn't look into her yellow eyes or see her tongue rolling forth like a big pink adhesive bandage as she sat panting outside the local pharmaceuticals, and at night she knew, was almost certain, that they couldn't hear her howl.
I mean, I just love, and hearing you read it makes it even more poignant. This girl's got some issues. She's got some problems. Tell us a little bit about what's going on there and some of the themes that you put in the poem and what's going on happening there.
It's one of my lupus poems. When I was in my early 20s, I was diagnosed with lupus when I was an undergraduate. And I had treatment for about 10 years or so for that, and then slowly went into remission. So I don't still have those issues, but I did get a lot of poetry out of the issues. And I think having the personal experience with chronic illness is also what has fueled my continuing interest in the body and illness. And the themes of this poem in particular is, some illnesses have more clout than others, right? We have... there certainly is lupus awareness foundations, and October is Lupus Awareness Month. But the persona in this poem is suffering a sort of not having one of those glamorous illnesses, and it's also a very difficult illness to diagnose. So it's I think some of those themes come out as well. So I do like the poem still. It's one that I didn't write during the era where I was writing most of my lupus poems. It is one that came later, kind of looking back, and it's a little bit more mature of a poem, I think. But I enjoy it still.
Yeah, it's a great poem. I love it very much. A couple other poems I want to ask you about. Janie Blake, Where Are You? Another poem that I really, really liked that had so many just a lot of good stuff going on. It's Janie Blake, Where Are You? Who's Janie Blake? What's happening to her in your particular poem?
Okay. This poem is based on a real girl who was growing up in my middle school classes, and she was in high school as well, and she had cancer as a child. And in the poem, I do turn that experience into a lupus poem, even though I wasn't experiencing any of that during that time. But it's a poem about fearing illness and what we don't know, and how as children we can be cruel to others. And in the poem, she is taunted at school and locked in the locker bay, and people try to lift her wig up, and so we see a child being taunted, and the persona, the speaker of the poem, doesn't want to end up like her ever. And then, ultimately she does. She does end up with a chronic illness and gets that late understanding in life what that's about. That's a much longer poem, so I won't read that one, but very similar themes in terms of illness and coming to grips with that and growing up and some of those themes.
Excellent, very good. Another poem I liked, and we'll get to some poems and make this seem like the list of things that I just like, but ones that really spoke to me. Flipping Mrs. Kirby, another one I really liked. Okay. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in that one.
I haven't thought about that poem in quite a while. That's another illness poem where the speaker is visiting her grandmother, I believe. The grandmother is dying in the hospital. And it's a poem about pain and accepting death and illness and pain. And Mrs. Kirby is a very large woman who's sharing the room with the grandmother, and the persona witnesses then the nurse is coming in and having to flip her, and is just in shock, I think, by some of that. And it's also a poem about the relief that I think passing can bring as well.
Yeah, absolutely, and I love that, because that idea of having somebody next to you that needs special treatment. I mean, here you are not doing well, but then you've got, you know, the sounds and the images and what we think's going on there was really, really good, and I really like that. And then you have another poem in the collection I really like, Woman to Woman. And I liked it because I felt like as I was reading that, I had in my mind a woman who was sort of the narrator. I had in my mind another woman who would be listening to that. And then I found myself at the end of the poem thinking about different people that could occupy both of those roles. Both different women that could be the narrator, different women that could be on the other side, listening to that or hearing that, or reading those words. Tell us a little bit about some of the issues brought up in Woman to Woman, because I think reading that, I could imagine different women in those roles, but I think as we look at what's going on today with sexual harassment allegations in the public, and women really fighting back against that, which is certainly an appropriate thing and justifiable. But I felt like that poem really resonated well, given everything that's going on. So tell us a little bit about Woman to Woman.
You're really bringing up some poems that I haven't thought about in a while. That one is an older poem. This collection has some poems that do go back 20 plus years, and that one is one of my earlier poems when I first really started writing and sending some work out. I think I'll read that one because it's hard for people to kind of get what it's about.
It's wonderful poem.
I think this is more of a sisterhood poem, friendship poem. Those moments where you want to tell your friends, not to step in certain territory, and that need of wanting to protect your friends. And so Woman to Woman, when I see trouble and you are blind. I think that says a lot.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to be one of the 2-inch gargoyles suspended from your curtain rod. Want to hide amongst your black silk shears, wide-eyed, watching for the first time your perfect white skin and fashion sense, without jealousy, without words, lectures, without that need to call you sister, friend. I want to protect without your knowing, cast spells, an evil eye on the man you can't love without alcohol, the man who pulls your hair, fills your ears with songs of love, then drains you inch by inch until you crack dry and bleed. I want to bite his ankles, his penis with poisoned teeth, prevent him from thrusting, from driving himself into you, confusing you, making you want, making you dream of the babies you think you need. I want to shatter your silence with my own piercing gargoyle cry, populate his nightmares, force him to acknowledge my watching, my sitting, ugly and threatening, your guardian against evil influences. It is a little more timely now, isn't it?
Yes.
With everything in the news.
Yeah, absolutely. And just hearing you read that again, it was so good to hear you read that in your voice. And I'm thinking of 3 women that could be the narrator, 3 women, different women than when I'd read it, earlier, that I could see having this conversation, and one saying, "This is, keep this in mind. Here's what you need to do," and the other person needing that advice, sort of absorbing that information, and it's just a wonderful poem that really puts the reader, I think, in the heart of your language and your prose, which is great.
It's not one I usually read aloud, so it's interesting to go back to that one.
Yeah, it was great. I enjoyed it very much. Now you have another chapbook you brought with us, Sheila-Na-Gig, and I may have pronounced that incorrectly, but tell us a little bit about that collection. Now I understand that was an earlier collection that was put together before the What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward To collection, right?
Yes, and Sheila-Na-Gig, it's not my work. This is actually other people's work. So Sheila-Na-Gig was a magazine that I co-founded in 1990 and published it out of California. I ran it for 10 years. We published 14 volumes. We received submissions from all over the nation, and had some chapbook contests that we did, and different things. And was just my baby, So in addition to writing poetry and teaching, I've always had that little bit of a bug as an editor in me, and I think it's a great way to just stay on top of what's being written today. As an editor, just you make lots of friends, you meet other editors. It's a whole little community that I just love. And when I left California in 2000 to come to Athens to pursue the Ph.D. program, I did put the journal to bed, and I never thought about going back to it again. But then in the summer 2015, I decided there's so much great technology out there now, and it's so much easier to run a magazine online than it used to be to even put these little volumes out. So I decided to reawaken Sheila-Na-Gig online, and I'm now in my second year of publishing online.
How's that process been?
It has been wonderful. So many people who had appeared in the first journals in the 90s found me online and sent their work in, or they remembered me being out there in the 90s. And so it's been a great response. My first volume online, I just had a really strong, good batch of writers and really set the bar high, I think, for the online version, so I'm happy with that. But I'm getting submissions from all over the world, not just the nation, but the world, so it's very exciting. And I do limit publication to about 35 authors, and publishing quarterly. And it's just been so much fun to get back into all of that.
Great, fantastic.
I do run a contest with that for individual poems and have a small prize for that. And my newest venture with Sheila-Na-Gig is Sheila-Na-Gig Editions. I'm going to be publishing full collections of work. The first collection should be out in the next couple of months. And it's by a gentleman named Mark Swan. And Mark was someone we published in the 90s and also happened to find me again. And so I thought he'd be a nice person to kind of come full circle with and put his collection out. And once we have his collection out, I'll be doing contests for full collections. But they'll have a sample of what it will be like. And so I'm very excited about that.
That sounds like a great project. Yeah, that sounds great.
And so much easier to do online now, and we'll be doing it as a print-on-demand project, so you don't have all that overhead that I had as an undergrad with my first credit card putting out Sheila-Na-Gig.
Yes, yeah, you don't have to do those print runs and have boxes of books sitting
Right.
around and wondering if somebody's gonna buy them. Yeah, very good. So Hayley, in our final moments with you today, if someone wants to get in contact with you to talk to you about poetry or your poetry writing, or get in contact with you to talk about your chapbook, What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward to, or Sheila-Na-Gig, or anything else, first of all, how can they get in contact with you, and where can they get copies of your chapbook?
Okay. My chapbook is available on Amazon and also through Finishing Line Press. They're out of Kentucky, but Amazon's a great place to get that. And a good place to get a hold of me is my OU email address. It's Haugen, Haugen, @ohio.edu. So I'm happy to chat with people. And Sheila-Na-Gig, I think I gave you the address for that. We can maybe put up, and especially for aspiring writers out there, looking for places online to send your work. It's such a different day. When I started as an undergraduate sending my work out, we had to actually buy those copies of the magazines.
Yes.
They just weren't online. But there's so much online now that you can find places for your work, or find work to get inspired by. Just from running the magazine, I'm continually inspired. People ask, what do you read? Well, I read what people send me for Sheila-Na-Gig, and it's very exciting to and most of the people have books out, so then I buy their books, and it's just a way to keep supporting writers.
Absolutely, very good. Hayley Haugen has been our guest here today on Chapters, Professor of English and Creative Writing at Ohio University Southern. We've been talking to her today about poetry, about her career as a poet, but also about her chapbook, What the Grimm Girl Looks Forward to, and also her online literary publication now, Sheila-Na-Gig. Hayley, it's been a pleasure having you here on Chapters, and we appreciate you coming on. And as you keep writing more poetry, and as Sheila-Na-Gig keeps growing and developing further, we'll have you back on to talk more about it. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Elliot, and thank you for all you do for local writers, too.
Sure, my pleasure. We also want to take a moment to say thanks to Chris Dargish and the staff and management of Empire Books and News for providing our on-site support and assistance today. We encourage you to come down to Empire Books and News and inquire about Hayley's chapbook collection, and also would remind you that many of the authors, editors, and publishers you've seen featured on the program have their works for sale right here at Empire Books and News. So come on down to Pullman Square in Huntington, and they can get you taken care of for any reading taste that you might need satisfied. If you're a user of social media, we'd love to hear from you with your questions, comments, or feedback about this chapter's program or any chapter's program that you've seen here on Armstrong Television. One of the ways you can get in contact with us is through email, and the email address is right here at the bottom of the screen. We do ask that you send us your name and your community or town on which you're writing from so that we can keep track of that correspondence. We also have a YouTube page where you can go back and watch all of our author, editor, and publisher interviews through the Armstrong One Wire page on YouTube, and that address is right here at the bottom of the screen also. So just look for the Chapters tab or the Chapters button when you go on YouTube, and we've got everything archived for you there from the very first episode we did all the way up until our most current episode. And if you're a Facebook user, we've got a Facebook page for Chapters on the Facebook.com website, and that specific address is also here at the bottom of the screen. On our Facebook page, we have more of our recent author, editor, and publisher interviews archived there as well. But you can comment on the episodes that you've watched, interact with other viewers, share those videos to your Facebook page, link those up to Instagram, whatever platforms you have connected to your Facebook page. So whatever social media platform you like in order to get in contact and stay in contact with us and also share the programs, we've made that available to you through YouTube, through email, and through Facebook. And so we appreciate all the feedback and support that we do get about the program through those social media avenues. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters, but please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.